Okay, I have a little story to tell. We're going to go on this journey together. My aunt called me a little while ago and said, hey, my neighbor needs to have a couple quilts done for her. Is that something that you do? And I said, no, I really don't sell my quilts. They're kind of my babies once I get done with them and spend that amount of time with them. And I usually just keep them. She said, well, I gave her your number. She might be calling. Okay, fine. I'm thinking maybe the lady wants a couple little baby quilts for a baby shower. That's usually what I get asked to do. And I thought, well, maybe just as a favor to my aunt, I would do it. So the lady calls me. No, that's not what she's looking for at all. She's looking for some actual quilts. So I asked her some details about it. And she basically is kind of like a prop master. And she works for this company that does props for, like theaters or, like how they have people stage for movies and theaters and things like that. She is working this event. And I Googled. It's the 50th anniversary of Little House on the Prairie. And I don't know if you grew up with that show, but I did, and I absolutely love it. And so she is tasked with putting together the set, recreating the set of Little House on the Prairie. And so she's looking for a couple of quilts. She needs Ma and Pa's quilt. And if you remember, it kind of looks like just a bunch of squares, and it's kind of like dark blues and browns and grays, very plain, very probably appropriate to the time. And then she also needed for the upstairs where Laura and Mary would sleep in the loft, their quilt. And so she sent me some pictures, and the fabric is very not period appropriate. It is like 70s and 80s fabric. It had red, white, and blue, centennial kind of timeline, and anchors, very not appropriate Little House on the Prairie time, but we're going to do our best to locate that. So to make a long story short, I jumped at the chance because no matter what happened, I wanted to be part of this. Like, that's one of my favorite shows growing up, and I wanted to be a part of it. So we headed out to Lucky Deluxe Fabrics in Anaheim, and they are always my first go-to whenever I'm looking to test one of my own patterns at first, because everything's $4 a yard. You can't go wrong with that. But they also like to save fabric from the landfill. They get a lot of donations from estate sales and things like that. So you can always find some great vintage fabric, and I found some. I told them I needed some red, white, and blue that was period appropriate. They were able to help me out with some of this. And then I also went by Joanne and I got some just basic red, white, and blue that I think we can fill in there. And then for Ma and Pa's quilts, they were able to find me a bunch of flannel and wovens that seemed like it could be period appropriate. And so I have assigned that quilt, the task of making that quilt, to Grandma Honey. And so she's going to be cutting up all the squares and sewing them all together. I have been tasked with the difficult one. And not that it's difficult, it's definitely going to be time consuming. But I was able to find or a friend actually was able to find for me, what I think might be the pattern for it. And it's a free pattern by Andover, and it's called Mary's Quilt. It's a free pattern. You can download it yourself. I would love to see if you make one. It's nothing but half square triangles. It's a bigger half square triangle surrounded by smaller half square triangles. So now half square triangles are not difficult to make. They're just time consuming to trim. And you have to trim them up. They are cut on the bias, and so they're very stretchy, and they kind of move around when you're sewing them. So I'm going to be doing that for a while, but first let's go prep our fabric.
Now, because these are just going to be props, I'm not going to worry too much about pre-washing and all of that. They're not going to be used. They're just going to be sitting there. So I'm just going to give everything a good press with some starch, because I am working with half square triangles, and anything cut on the bias is going to be a little stretchy, and this will help everything stay a lot better when I go to sew and trim.
So this pattern is all half square triangles. There's some that are larger, and you can see I've done the traditional way of just marking from corner to corner. But there's also going to be a lot of tiny ones. And when I have ones like this, I like to pull out my bias seam tape and put it onto my machine. I even run it all the way down here in case I have some that just hangs over a little bit. I can make sure that my points stay on those lines. So if you haven't seen this before, this is a great trick for half square triangles. It allows you to just keep moving along and chain stitching, and you don't have to take the time to mark a line on all of them. It's a great time saver. So you line up where the red line is matching your needle. So I like to run mine right up to my needle and then start there and then pull away and make sure that you're going straight as you can. And for half square triangles, you will put the points on this black line here. And that way you are automatically going to be sewing that 1/4 inch seam right here down the red where your needle goes. So invest in this. It's not that much money and it lasts forever because you're just using a little bit at a time, and I leave mine on there for months and months until it just literally falls off, and then I replace it. So I've had this one for probably a couple years now. It's a great investment. Ahead a couple months into the process, I've been going slow so I don't completely burn myself out with trimming all of those half square triangles. It's taken me many nights of putting a movie on, sitting there and trimming. You can see that I have finished the quilt top other than the borders that pattern calls for. And I sent this picture to the prop master just to get her take on things and see how she feels that they're going. It's obviously not the pattern from Little House on the Prairie, but it would be sort of time specific to Little House on the Prairie time. And we decided to go with a red border. So I am now cutting up a red border. I'm going to be attaching that, and then we can get to the quilting fun. The long arm all set up. I do not plan to quilt in the borders. I think I'm going to do a cream thread all in the middle there. And I know that long arming is not time period correct. However, I don't know how much this quilt is going to be manhandled in moving it around and getting it all set up, or what if it gets dirty and someone tries to launder it. I still want to make sure that everything gets stuck down really well, especially with all of those triangles on the bias. So I think I'm going to do a longer stitch, maybe to kind of make it look like it might be hand stitching. And I'll just do, I don't know, maybe just like a loose meandering line to stick everything down. I've decided to go with a striped binding on the Little House on the Prairie quilt. I love striped binding. I don't know what it is. Maybe it reminds me of candy canes. But I know sometimes for people, it's a little tricky to line everything up so that it looks like one continuous piece of fabric. What you don't want to do is join it and then you have your stripes that are all mismatched, and then it's very obvious that you've joined your quilt binding there. So here's a little trick that I like to do. We're gonna lay one of our pieces along like this, and then we're going to lay our other piece down like this. Now, normally we would just sew here and then we would cut it off at 1/4 inch and then open it up. But we don't know for sure that these are going to match. So what I like to do is go ahead and fold it into that little 45-degree angle there. And then you'll have it like this. And then you can kind of line up exactly where you want it to go. But how do we make sure that it's going to stay there and not move around? This is my favorite little trick. Grab yourself some fabric glue or even a glue stick. This is a basic glue stick. Walmart, Office Depot, wherever you want to get it. Put a tiny little bit right along where that 1/4 inch seam would be. I do this for all of my binding when I'm actually putting it onto my quilt also. It makes it really easy. I don't have to do any pins or clips or anything. And then we're going to line this up. And we want it to go where all of these stripes are going to match. And I have a little bit of a difficult one because I have some double thicker stripes here and thin single stripes here. So I'm trying to be as accurate as I can. I'm gonna stick it on there. I will grab my iron and just set it on there. And that heat is gonna set the glue. Now what you don't wanna do is take the iron off and then pull back on it because it's going to come right off. The glue hasn't set yet. So I'm gonna put this like this and also glue it this way just to make sure it's really on there. And then put my iron away. And you can still see your line there where we pressed it. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna sew just a thread or two into this side of that line that I marked. Just a thread or two right along there. That way when I open it up, I'm being careful here because I don't want the glue to come off yet. That way when I open it up, you can see that all of my stripes are perfectly matched. And as you look at your quilt, it looks just like one giant continuous piece of fabric. Now with all of my piecing, including this binding, I like to use a stitch length of 2. That way I feel like my pieces are really secure. They're not going to come apart. I'm going to trim this off at 1/4 inch and press my seams open. That way my binding is nice and flat and there's no bulk that my machine has to try and sew through and I don't end up with any skipped stitches. But once you fold it back, there you go. You have some perfectly matched up stripes.